Tonight's topic is democracy. Some of the positive and some of the negative sides of democracy. Let's start by describing what I'm going to mean by democracy. Different people mean different things. I'm starting with the pure idea of democracy, which means that power rightfully belongs in the hands of the total population of people. And that means that the most pure expression of democracy would be what's called a direct democracy, where every person who's eligible to vote, and that might compromise the proposition, votes directly on every proposition before the government to be decided, and every decision is made on the basis of a majority vote. Now, there is a widespread impression that democracy is more moral than other forms of government, more just. So, I'd like to suggest a source for that idea, and then test exactly how far it goes and how well it works. If you start with the idea that coercing someone to do something is wrong, democracy minimizes coercion. Because if democracy means always majority having their way, then in all cases you coerce only a minority. Any other system which differs with it will sometimes coerce the majority. And then you have more coercion. So if coercing people to do something they don't want to do is an evil, then democracy minimizes this evil. That's a reason in favor of the morality of democracy. Now, let's make the obvious point that it means that there is a moral reason for democracy. It doesn't mean it's the only moral reason there is. And sometimes moral reasons conflict, and sometimes other moral reasons are more important. So there's no question that there'll be times when following the rule of democracy will give an outcome that we think is a wrong outcome. But that doesn't do away with the moral status of democracy. It means that democracy contributes one morally positive element to a situation. And if you want to do something other than what the majority decides, you need another more compelling moral consideration. That's not zero. That means that a competing consideration has an uphill battle. Democracy is not something that can just be dismissed. Now, just to give an illustration, that in an individual case and a democratic case, coercion of the majority or of individuals is not always wrong. And to show you how tricky this judgment is, there was an article in The Economist, I guess about 15 years ago. The article was about probability and how badly people misunderstand probability, in particular doctors who are making decisions on your medical treatment on the basis of the highest probability, and they've got a clue what they're talking about. They make the most elementary errors in probabilistic reasoning. But there was an incident reported that a young man in Britain at the time took a test for AIDS, and he tested positive. And he read in the description of the test that the test had 4% false positives. 4% false positives. I tested positive. It was a 96% probability that I have AIDS. Means it's virtually certain that I have AIDS, and he committed suicide. Poor fellow. He was just making a mistake. He doesn't know what 4% false positive means. His probability of having the disease was probably 1% or something like that. He just made a mistake. If you like, later I'll tell you what the mistake was. Now just imagine, you hear this guy, he's coming out of the place where he gets the test results, and he's mumbling to himself. 4% false positives, 96%. I am tested positive. I'm over. My life is over. I'm dead. I can't go on like this. You hear him talking. So you say, could I talk to you for a minute? Just a minute. I have something that I think you need to know. No, my life is over. Don't talk to me. I can't face it. Nothing means anything anymore. He's buying the gun and the ammunition. Listen, this is really important. You got to know this. No, he's loading the gun. What do you do now? Everybody is autonomous. Nobody should interfere with anybody else. And he's going to blow his brains out. Do you think you should stop him? He's going to blow his brains out over a mistake. I hope you agree that you should stop it. Because when you explain it to him, he'll be grateful to you for the rest of his life. So you should stop him from doing what he wants to do. You should use force to stop him. So resisting force, resisting compulsion is not always right. Sometimes compulsion is correct. Now, where to draw the line is an interesting question. You have an addict, he's an alcoholic, and he's been through 2 rehabilitation programs and relapsed. There's a new program, you happen to know it from the inside, you have statistics, people who failed twice, like he did, 98% come out clean now. He can't face it. He's got the courage to hustle it, to say, well, it's a free world, everybody does what he wants, and he'll just die in 6 months in a cesspool. No, I don't think you have to do that. I think you can enroll him against his will, force him into it, and 3 years later, when he's clean, he'll love you forever. So the question is, where do you draw the line? How far do you allow people to injure themselves on the basis of autonomy without stopping them from injuring themselves? And then, what counts as an injury? I give easy cases where later, when the process is over, he'll thank you for doing it. What about a case where when it's over, he won't thank you because he doesn't agree with your values? Maybe he won't come to agree with your values till 30 years later, look back on it. Suppose he would have come to agree with you 30 years later, but he dies before that. Was it right to do? Was it not right to do? There are tricky questions here. But one thing's for sure, it's not always wrong to coerce people to do things that they don't want to do. Not always. But, as a starting point, if what you propose is to coerce somebody to do something he doesn't want to do, you have to have a reason to override that. Because coercing him is an evil. It may be the lesser of 2 evils, but it's an evil, and you have to face that. So this would be one way to start the discussion about democracy, that it has a moral superiority because it minimizes coercion, a moral advantage over any other political system. Are we together so far? Okay, but now no country on earth has direct democracy. None, not one. Why is that? You say, well, come on, it's impractical to have everyone vote on every issue. Once upon a time, it was impractical. That's true. When you had to collect votes by horseback, and bring them together and inform people and get information, that was very difficult. But today, it's very easy. Everybody votes with a thumbprint. Come home at night, over evening tea, you put it on the screen says there are these 6 issues that need to be decided, and you put your thumbprint on the yes, no time, you finish it and go back to your tea. We could do that. Thumbprints are unique, and we have the technology for doing it. Nobody's proposing it. I wonder if there's a reason for that. What do we have instead of direct democracy? We have representative democracy. That's really a term in political science, representative democracy. The democracy expresses itself in electing representatives. And the representatives make decisions. Why is that? Why would people give up, listen carefully, the moral superiority of minimizing coercion and hand over power to the representatives who, at least temporarily, can force coercion on the majority? Mele, if it's a flexible system, collapsible in a coherent system like Israel and Great Britain and France and others who have parliamentary system, where in principle you could have elections every week, and some do. But in the meantime, between elections, what the parliament decides is law, even if it goes against the majority. Much worse in the United States of America, where there are fixed times for elections. The president's up every 4 years. if half a year into his term, you do a poll and 92% of the people in the country disagree with his decisions, too bad. Too bad. You can't do anything about it till 3.5 years later. Why would anybody give up the moral superiority of direct democracy for representative democracy? What are we getting in return that makes it somehow appropriate to give up direct democracy? So you'll get the following type of argument. Well, decisions that are being made, you often are very complex. They deal with very complex realities. The vast majority of people don't understand those realities. Truthfully, neither do the elected representatives who understand those realities, even in their sober moments, which are few, but they hire top-notch experts. They can pay them unlimited amounts of money to gather information and make recommendations. In a sense, that's what we pay them for. We pay them to be full-time decision makers on the basis of the best information. Okay, so they'll make the best decisions with the best information. So what? What will they produce with all that wonderful information and wonderful decisions? Well, presumably more money, more power, more creativity. I mean, the economy will run much better with better decisions. If that's the case, if that's the reason, then we're trading morality for economy. We're trading morality for economy. How important could the morality have been if we're willing to sell it for a higher GDP? Or are we just doing something wrong? We just really should go back to direct democracy. But then you have a hospital, and this question is raised to do a certain new type of surgery. Should everybody working at the hospital vote? The economists, the publicizers, the cleaning staff, should they all vote on whether the surgery should be done? Democracy! But they don't know anything about it. So you don't really want the voting, do you? You only want people who know something about the subject to have a say and a controlling vote as to what should be done. So then, if they're not in favor of it, one because his cousin's going to lose his job, and another because his salary's going to cut in half, so I'm afraid I'm not in favor of that surgery. I said, too bad. We're forcing it on you. You can't avoid it because it's better for health, or it's better, by the way, it can be better for the economics of the hospital. I have a friend who's a doctor, and this was in the 70s, and the hospital didn't have a bypass unit. And they petitioned the management. The management said, if you can guarantee us 5 bypasses a week, we'll get you a unit. They got them a unit, and they guaranteed the bypasses. A guy comes into the emergency room, and he's fainting. Too much blood to the brain, huh? Couldn't it be? He must need a bypass. Downstairs, quick! So there are all sorts of reasons why decisions are made. So if you're really trading democracy for efficiency and power and better GDP, if it has a moral punch, it's not being treated as very, very serious. Otherwise, you would say, I'm sorry, you don't pay to do immoral things. You do immoral things because you'll be paid to do them. So how terribly immoral, can it be? Now, some people will tell you, you hear it on the streets here, that democracy also means separation of powers, like we have in the United States. And you have to a certain extent, although much less so in other countries. Well, I think in the interest of clarity, it should be understood that democracy doesn't mean that. It just doesn't. Democracy means that the power rightfully belongs to the total population. That's what it means. But democratic states, liberal democratic states, have become characterized with a certain amount of separation of powers. So it's something that's associated with normal democracy. I mean, in Athens, you didn't have it. But it's become associated. Well, okay, it's become associated, but So what? What role does it play? Why is it interesting or important? So then you hear the phrase, it prevents the tyranny of the majority. Wow, that's semantics, that's poetry. The tyranny of the majority. That means to say democracy is inherently tyrannical. Inherently tyrannical. Everything is always tyrannical. Because if the majority's rule is a tyranny, and that's what democracy says, the majority should always rule. Oh, we didn't mean that. I know we said it, but we didn't mean it. We sort of meant that sometimes the majority gets it wrong. Yeah. Anybody can get something wrong. That doesn't make him a tyrant. Just because he gets something wrong from time to time, gets something wrong. Why would you call that a tyranny? It's democracy. The majority determines the outcome. That's democracy. That's not tyranny. By definition, it's not tyranny. So what they mean is, well, there are certain types of decisions which is always wrong for the majority to impose on the minority. Always. In principle. Not just that by accident they got it wrong. By accident somebody was prejudiced. No, it's always wrong. And that being the case, since they're exercising a decision that's always wrong to exercise, we call it tyranny so that it sounds good on the street and we can throw firebombs at your cars. But, it's sort of like, it's an exaggeration. It makes it about 50 times as bad. But it gets across the idea that something's desperately wrong here. Okay. So then you want to limit the power of the majority to determine the outcome, because somehow it's inherently inappropriate for it to control that sort of thing. Inherently inappropriate according to whom? According to whom? Wouldn't that depend upon what your basic values are? What you think is important? What you think is right or wrong? Let's take, for example, redistributing income. Taxing the rich in order to pay for the services to the poor. There are people who think that's wrong. There are people who think that in principle you don't take money from one person to pay somebody else's bills. Sorry, you don't do that. If you did it as a private person, you'd be a thief, for sure. If I steal your money to pay his medical bills, I'm just stealing your money. Makes no difference what I'm spending it on. But the government, when they take your money to pay his medical bills, that's fine. Wait, really? A libertarian would say that's just as cruel, just as criminal. So we got to stop that. Others say, criminal? That's charitable. That's the highest virtue. How can you call it criminal? So if you want to stop the majority from making decisions which are inherently wrong, the whole category of decisions is wrong, you're going to do it on the basis of the rest of your morality to decide which category is inherently wrong. Privacy. There is a proposition in American political and social political thinking that what a person does in private is his own business. The law has no business regulating private behavior. The law has no business regulating private behavior. Why is that? Well, because a crime, for the law, the crime has to have a victim. And since he's doing it in private, nobody's hurt by it. So then the law shouldn't regulate it. Really, nobody's hurt by it. I wonder, suppose he's experimenting with an addictive substance. He's experimenting on his own. He paid for it. He raised it in his backyard. He grew it himself. It's a chemical compound, and he made the chemical compound. He's experimenting with it. But we know that 72% of the people who experiment with this drug end up addicted. And pure forms are very hard to get, and they're very expensive, so they become criminals eventually. And then other people get hurt. So should we coerce him with respect to his private behavior? If 10 years down the line, he's going to be holding up people with guns for robbery to pay for his habit? Maybe we should. But then, doesn't everything you do have some impact on your character, on your morals, on your motivation, on your psychology? Even the things you do in private. If you do it, then it ingrains a habit or frustrates a habit, both of which might be good or bad. It builds up certain abilities and tears down other abilities. Could you imagine something done in private which in principle would never have an effect on other people? It'd be very hard to imagine that. So that being the case, maybe you can regulate private behavior. Think of the feminist critique on pornography. Free speech! I can say what I want, read what I want, project what I want, share what I want. Not according to them, because you degrade women in men's eyes, and women suffer from that. Men's behavior to women becomes cruel and insensitive and prejudicial, and women suffer. They say, no, we don't want men watching pornography in private. They shouldn't do it in private. It should be outlawed that there should be such a thing. Okay, then can you draw the line at private behavior? This idea of where the majority is taking a decision in a whole category which is off limits for the majority to make is quite a difficult idea. Nevertheless, there are people who want to make rules. I think this rule has been expressed. I think it's very short-sighted that you don't regulate private behavior. What about wearing seatbelts in my car? My seatbelt in my car. You can't tell me what to do in my living room. In my garden, how can you tell me what to do in my car? It's my car. We can tell you. We can tell you. Well, how can you tell me? What's the reason for it? I'll tell you what the reason is for it. Because all hospital bills today are paid by insurance companies. And insurance companies have to raise money. And you're causing more losses, which means they have to raise their rates. So you're raising the rates for everybody by taking a chance of having an accident and thereby increasing the hospital costs. Oh, so it's sort of not really private anymore because statistically it's going to have an effect on everybody's rates. Well then, so now let's go back to the matter of principle. You have the democracy. Democracy follows the majority vote. Majority vote can be wrong, and there have to be ways and means to prevent it, and those ways and means may be based on your other morality, but that means there have to be ways to try and stop it. Now, in the United States, where you have division of powers, specifically where you have only one that is fully democratic, and that's the legislature, then you have the judiciary and you have the executive. Well, the executive is in part democratic. You vote for the president, but everything beyond that is just his appointing power. The judicial is also partly democratic. Listen, guys in the streets who are blocking the traffic. I've never seen one of them even consider the argument that in the United States, you can't become a Supreme Court justice without democratic input. It's got to be proposed by the Senate and ratified proposed by the president, ratified by the Senate. The idea of a judiciary that isn't controlled by democratic input, that's not democratic. But when you get him into the position of justice of the Supreme Court, then nothing democratic can stop them, or nothing democratic. They have limits by which they can set on the democratic process. They can declare their law unconstitutional, and then their decision is final. So you have this interaction between the three of them. That's one thing that it helps to make the expression of the majority rule diluted and in need of coordination with other types of agreement, which make it less unified and less directly powerful than a simple vote would have been. The truth is that the separation of powers in the United States as another famous source, which may not be as prominent in other democratic states, but because of our American history, winning a war of independence against Great Britain, the great enemy from the point of view of the founders of the United States was tyranny. They lived under a tyranny, that's the way they perceived it, and they were willing to fight and die to overcome it. And tyranny means all power centralized. In the case of an autocracy, it means in one person. You can have a nobility which has power also. It's a small group of people. One way that you dilute power even by the elected representatives of the people, elected institutions, is to cause them to have to coordinate with one another. And you set up a certain kind of competition. In the United States is done with studied vagueness and ambiguity. It's not really clear what happens when there's a conflict between one of the two of the three branches of the federal government. It's just not clear. The rules aren't written in very clearly. So when Nixon was president and the Supreme Court said, turn over your recordings of your telephone conversations that you made in the White House, Nixon said, who are you to tell me? You are the judicial branch and I'm the executive branch. Who says you can tell me that I have to turn them over? Wie steht geschrieben in Yiddish? Where is it written that you have more power than I do? It was very difficult. A few elections ago, when Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida, and they had ballots with places where you take the pencil and push a hole through which position you're voting for, and you had the ones where the person pushed against the hole and didn't make it through, didn't break the paper. The dimpled Chad, where you could see where the paper bulges, because that's where you put the pencil, but it didn't go through and make a hole. Shall it be counted or shall not be counted? So it went to the Supreme Court. You know what Jeb Bush said? I don't care what the Supreme Court says. The states elect electors, and the electors elect the president. Federal courts, the federal government had nothing to do with telling me how to run the votes in my state. Fortunately for the United States, 5 out of the 9 justices agreed with his ruling and supported what he was doing. But had they not supported him, he claimed he was not bound by them at all. You create a system like that, you've got to convince people. You can't just assert it and take it over because you have the power. You have to convince, and you have to people who occupy a different position. The position of the judicial is a different position. The position of the executive is a different position. And by the way, the executive is hamstrung because any government department he wants to create or expand, only the Congress can give him the money. If they don't give him the money, nothing will happen. He can't make those things on his own. He's got to pay them. And he can't pay them if he hasn't got money. They can stop him with all his projects. So it's harder to make a decision. So this kind of democracy is slower, it's less flexible, takes more time, but in the end, many more people are on board when the decision is made. So it doesn't allow just a majority to control, but it takes into account a wide variety of interests. This is not democracy. This is something that's associated with democracies because of common practice among democracies to create it. So it has nothing to do with the meaning of democracy. So there are lots of compromises in the practice of democracy. And that seems to me to reflect the idea that although coercion is an evil, and if you're going to coerce someone to do something against his will, you need to have some more important moral consideration. There are lots and lots of moral considerations available. And even, which I think is still philosophically questionable, even efficiency of government and productivity of government, the GDP, can be used to dilute democracy on the grounds that somehow this is more important than the matter of coercion, even though coercion is supposed to be an evil. So I think what comes out of this general picture is that democracy is a value, but it's a value that is competing with other values and is often overridden by other values, and sometimes is overridden even by matters of utility, which aren't matters of values. That's what I would sum up what I've said so far about democracy. Are we together so far? Okay. Now, I do this on a number of subjects to go through a philosophical review to see what's reasonable to think about a subject, and then I'll bring in the Jewish point of view, which otherwise might be too challenging to appreciate objectively. The idea of democracy has no place in Judaism at all. None at all. Plays absolutely no role. That the power rightly belongs with the people power rightly belongs with the people? Power, factually, and authority, rightfully, belongs only to God. Period. Sof pasuk. Nothing else to say. Anything that would be other than God that exercises power and authority does so by God's leave. He gave us a set of rules to live by, and if the rules say that so and so under these conditions has certain authority, then he gets it because of that. But not democracy is a moral principle that the rightful source of power and authority is the people. Morally speaking, we have no such starting point. When the creator of the universe is running the universe, it's not a starting point. So that kind of philosophical issue is certainly not there. Then you can ask, does the Torah imply any democratic types of structures which it certifies as the right way to go about things? Not because inherently it's so that people have power, but because the creator of the universe wants the world run that way. And here you have, I think, at least a couple of interesting ideas. First of all, the fact that the Sanhedrin votes is not an element of democracy at all, because no one is delegating to them the authority to make the decision for the country. It's 71 people. The majority of the 71 decide what's going to happen with 10 million people. That's not democratic at all. This is a question of how a group makes a joint decision. And, for example, in these types of groups, not all the rules are the same. For example, if a person is being tried in a capital case, and there are 23 judges, you can't convict on a vote of 12 to 11. You have to convict by at least 2. So you're not following the majority, because that's the way God said the court should work. So that's also a rule which is different for a different reason, but if all 23 agree to convict, he's not convicted. But it's not just following the majority, just different rules. So there's certainly no representative. There's no power in the hands of the people. 71 people for 10 million. That's certainly not a democratic idea. Yeah.
How do they elect the new members of the Sanhedrin? Is it self-elected?
No, they're not elected. Not at all. Here's how. Don't use the word elected. That prejudices the case from the beginning. Here's what happens. The original Sanhedrin was set up by God for Moses in the Torah. That's how it started. Now, there are people in training. There are yeshivas everywhere, and schools, and people have reputations, and there's a kind of informal competition. You have the 71, this is the way it was in Yerushalayim, 71 on the Sanhedrin, and then you have 71 disciples who are there to attend and observe and join in the discussion with the 71 Sanhedrin, and they are numbered by choice system in terms of talent, no elections at all. There are teachers and there are evaluators and testers by talent. And then if one of the members of the Sanhedrin is missing because he dies or because whatever isn't, then the number one out of the other 71 goes up, and they pick another one to come in, and they keep it running that way. So it's a meritocracy, is one of the things that they call something like this, where people are chosen because of their merit, because of their evaluated abilities, and they are brought into the Sanhedrin in that way. That's certainly not democratic at all. Yeah.
Were each one of the disciples paired up to a member of the Sanhedrin?
No, it was on the basis of when they went in.
No, but there was 71 and 71, right? So I just wondered.
Oh, no, not so far as I know.
So it wouldn't be like you learned and shadowed from a particular one.
No. You attended all the discussions. You heard all the debates back and forth. You saw the votes. So you had years of observing. If you're at the bottom of the 71 and they're going off one by one, you're there out of 5 years or 10 years or 15 years observing what's going on. That's real on-the-job training.
So there wouldn't be a need to be arbitrarily paired up to a specific.
No, not at all. No, that wouldn't have any sense. But you do have something which is, I would say, pretty clearly democratic. Now, not all Rishonim agree to this, but there's a statement in the Gemara Ein gozrin gzera al tzibur elam kein rov tzibur yicholin lamod bo. You don't make a decree on the community unless the majority of the people in the community can take it. That's what it says. Maimonides has a very radical way of understanding that statement in the Talmud. Let's suppose the Sanhedrin passes a law. They make a law. And let's suppose that the majority of the Jewish people never accept it. They rebel against it. They don't accept it and they don't do it. It doesn't become a law. It requires the majority to carry it out for it to become a law. This is direct democracy, voting with your feet. The Sanhedrin has to propose it. If everybody does it, it doesn't become a law. So Sanhedrin proposed, and that's why in the Talmud you have cases where a law is proposed 3 times. And the question is, why it have to be proposed 3 times? Why does the Sanhedrin have to pass it 3 times? From my mind, it's very simple. The first 2 times the Sanhedrin passed it, the people didn't do it. Only the 3rd time, that's when it became a law. So here, for enacting rabbinic legislation would require the whole of the population. Yeah.
Are there any cases in history where that took place?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, can you give me a specific example of the
Shemen of goyim, goyish oil. Whether you should have a prohibition against the goyish oil. It took 3 times to get it to go through. So now why that is, I don't know exactly. And what you need to make it into a law, as I said a moment ago, is both the Sanhedrin should vote and the people should carry it out. You can undo it if the Sanhedrin changes its mind. That's all you need. The Sanhedrin votes against it. Later on, they decide to rescind it, then it's rescinded. Nothing there is said about the people failing to keep it or whatever. That's if I remember, nothing's said about that. But in other words, you need both things on board. You need to have both the Sanhedrin and the people on board to make it into a law. Once it's made into a law, if individuals violate it, they're violating the law and they're criminals and they're going to be punished for it. Yeah.
Are the people punished, or is it considered a sin if they don't follow through on a law passed by the Sanhedrin?
Well, I understand the Rambam was saying no, because it didn't become a law yet.
Okay.
And I assume the people know that. So the people are keeping records, The pollsters are, 42%. So, okay, 42%. But, let's see what happens tomorrow.
So there's not like a sense that they they refused a fitting law, and therefore they're less meritorious than they would otherwise be, or something like that.
Well, okay, once you take refuge in vagueness,
Fair
then
enough.
maybe they should respect the Sanhedrin more. Until I'm not commenting on that.
Fine.
They haven't violated the law. If the law carries a penalty, you can't apply the penalty to them, because the law has not been enacted. That's one thing. Another thing that you have is the Yeshivat Ohr. In Europe, there were actual elections. There were people who represented the Jewish community vis-a-vis the non-Jewish authorities, would negotiate with them and be an intermediary with the enactments, and then they also would take taxes for charity. This was done in Talmudic times also before elections, but they would be the ones to take taxes for charity. They had those accepted authority positions vis-a-vis the Jewish community, and they were in fact elected. So what you have to say here is that the vote of the community isn't zero. It isn't zero. If it can be necessary for rabbinic law to be enacted, and if in some cases it's appropriate to use a vote to determine who has authority over the community, it's used very widely in shuls, in Orthodox shuls, where there's a hierarchy in the shul, running the finances and other things that have to do with the shul, and there are elections and they elect them. This is regarded as legitimate. There is one other case that I know of where you have a kind of pseudo democracy. We have a rule in the Gemara, Din de Malchus Dina. You live in a country with laws, a non-Jewish country. there is reason to keep the non-Jewish laws. Again, it's specific, and there are exceptions, and there are things that override it. But in general, the idea is that you should keep the non-Jewish laws of the country. Many Rishonim say that's only if the country's rulership is legitimate. And legitimate means accepted by the people as rulers. So it certainly means that a majority of the people should be satisfied that these people should be rulers. That doesn't mean they don't complain about their policies, and sometimes don't rebel against their laws, but they agree that they should be the rulers. If it's a tyranny, if they're held in bondage simply by force, then the Jews who live there aren't bound by the rules of that government because it's a tyranny. It's not called a legitimate government. So according to that position, at least the very fact that this governmental structure is running the affairs of the country, that has to be agreed to by the people. Otherwise, it isn't a legitimate government. That's for non-Jewish governments, but not for Jewish government. Jewish government is bound by halacha and by input of prophecy when there was prophecy. I mean, it has nothing to do with the consent of the people. But so now that means, I would put it this way: consent of the people confers a certain status, but the Torah doesn't operate in terms of that status. It operates in terms of a much higher status. That the creator of the universe was a special relationship with the Jewish people. Wants it this way rather than a different way. Yeah.
But that's this is not the right way to phrase it, but that's partially acceptable from the view of the people because they understand that the Creator's will perfectly factors in their interests. And in lieu of a kind of governmental structure that could do that, then devolving down to a democracy or something which at least prevents the evil of coercion would be kind of like a second best result.
Well, I think I wouldn't say that the assumption with which you started is ironclad. Let's suppose, as happened during the First Temple period, there were times when many people worshipped idols.
That wasn't in their benefit, though.
Yeah, so you say. That's right, but they don't agree. Right? And if you'll ask them, do you think it's legitimate a king who will say no idol worship, and if they say no, we won't, they still can't change the fact that the king is legitimate ruler, and that he can punish them, even the majority. So it's not you're assuming an ideal situation. Governments are not made for ideal situations. If the situation is ideal, you could probably do away with the government. And the governments are there for when things go bad, they go wrong, and there are criminals, and there are rebellions, and so on and so on. And they have to make policy, and they have to set limits. So I don't think that's... So in other words, the Torah here, I would say, is indirectly crediting the idea that democracy has some moral force, but then it's superseding it on the basis of the fact that if you have a divine backing to your government, that's much higher than democracy. I also want to mention that this idea of separation of powers, I've seen some literature on this. It apparently traces it back in the ancient world only to the Jewish people. The idea of separation of powers, each with its own authority. I'm not a historian, but they have said this, is only found in Jewish sources. For example, King David does something, and Nathan the prophet accuses him on the throne of being a sinner. Sorry, you don't accuse the king of being a sinner. You don't do that. Divine right of kings, it's unthinkable. Off with your head. By the way, have you heard of the court jester? What was the court jester's job? Oh, everybody's life is so serious. God has a way of making jokes just to lighten the mood and atmosphere. Not at all. The function of the court jester was to express popular criticism of the king, but it's only a joke, sire. We didn't really mean it. And that way the king could get feedback from the people about his mistakes. Because you couldn't criticize the king. That was treason. That was the death penalty. So it's a very clever way to have the king get feedback without breaking the honor and authority of the king. In our system, The prophet comes to the king and sitting on the throne and says, "You're wrong. What you're doing is wrong. You're a criminal. You've done something wrong. You've got to rectify it." The Sanhedrin was not totally under the control of the king. The Sanhedrin passed laws, decided laws. The king had no input to that. No way to control that. So if you have prophets, one area of authority, and the Sanhedrin another area of authority, and the king's another area of authority, you have division of powers. And there can be conflicts between them. So that also slows down the government, and it will result in a much broader based support for policies that are carried through. And there's a direct divine input through the prophets. It means that the power of each institution is diluted. Maybe I missed. I don't know if I finished the point before, and then we can discuss it till the end. I said division of powers in the United States case was because they want against tyranny. The way it's set up with three different branches of government, and each one has to jockey with the other one, no one branch has total control. So you're not going to end up with somebody with all the control in his pocket. Everybody's looking over his shoulder at somebody else and thinking, yeah, but if he says no, then I'm in trouble. So I have to go and convince people of it. This, by the way, they say is the theory of the filibuster in the Senate. Right? You need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. It means a vote of 51 to 49 isn't good enough. Or 51 to 50 if the vice president comes in and breaks a tie. It's not enough. You need 60% versus 40% to say yes. That's a much broader consensus than 51-50 or 51-49. And that means you have to work harder at convincing other people that you're right. And then when the decision is made to stop the filibuster and actually vote, when the decision actually is made, then you have a much broader consensus behind it. This also slows things down and makes it harder to achieve and makes more negotiation and more compromise necessary. All of this brings a coherence to the popular support for the way democracy works. You have a question. There's one other point that I want to make, but I won't make it right away. So you had a question, yeah.
Do you think this slow pace of government will sort of interfere with, I suppose, speeding up communication, speeding up? Do you think that it's sort of designed to improve?
Well, take the First World War, the Second World War. The democracies won both wars against the states which were less democratic. So it seems like whether or not you have speed or agility and flexibility, if you have the overwhelming support of the people, it makes a gigantic difference. It's a gigantic difference. With the corruption and everything else. Can't compare it to a state like Russia or Ukraine, where everyone is corrupt and everybody's taking bribes and everybody's looking out for himself. You know, some of the military stuff that the United States gave to Ukraine ended up in Russia because the people who were handling it sold it to Russia. Are you going to kill your own people? What do you mean by my own people? My bank account goes up. Forget people. But, so, you know, if you have the voluntary support and commitment of the people, you have a very powerful resource. Yeah.
In the future, we'll see what China has to say about some of that. But in terms of their military projected power, but for the king, you were talking about at least in separation of powers with Torah. Doesn't the king also sit on the Sanhedrin, and doesn't he?
Not at all.
Doesn't he also have veto power in some cases?
Not at all.
The Sanhedrin has a capital case, and they say we're not going to convict. The king can use his own individual power to kill somebody.
Well, that's not veto power, and he can't do it the other way. You can't undo a decision of capital punishment and say I don't want him to die.
Right, but if they say we're not going to convict because it's unanimous, he can say I'm going to make.
Well, if he violates the authority of the king, right. But he hasn't had any interaction with the king, he can't do it. You can't just do it as a whim. The guy has to in some way violate the authority of the king. Now, I want to make one more remark because I think it's important in understanding what's going on in this country. This is a bitter remark, but I think it's true, and it's at least worth thinking about. The idea of a democracy is that the decisions are made through the democratic process. Everybody has his red lines. Everybody has its red lines. Democracy, vote, representatives, yeah, up to here. But beyond here, we won't accept it even if it's voted. Everybody has his red lines. So when somebody takes to the streets and somebody uses violence and so forth and so on, I think that realistically speaking, democracy works only through the acceptance of the people for the areas in which the vote is what counts. And beyond that, everybody has his red lines. So, for example, when the government wanted to enact a policy, I guess this is 60, 70 years ago, of drafting the religious girls into the army, they were told, that's war. That's war. You will not get that. We'll be in the streets and we'll do whatever is necessary to stop it. So the leftists here in the government, in the country now, who are stopping traffic and everything else, everybody has red lines. Everybody. So it isn't as if somehow democracy is real and this is somehow, it is anti-democratic. It definitely is. It's to say we accept democracy up to a certain point, but when what the democratic decision is doing is too immoral, too unjust, at that point we're not going to credit the democracy. The moral loss in crediting the democracy is greater than the loss in allowing the democracy to have its way and do its destruction. So the leftists in the United States, who on the basis of BLM or all the other things that we can complain about the hypocrisy of their causes, but the idea that they use violence to stop the normal government from functioning is part of what underlies democratic government. In the 30s, when unions were being promoted, and there were strikes, and there were strike breakers, people who went to work against the strike of the workers, right? The strikers shot at them. They shot at them. No? This is the whole economic future of a whole class of people. You're walking in to make a temporary profit. What you're doing is wrong. What the government is doing is wrong. We're shooting at you. So I'm not condoning it. I'm not promoting it. I'm just pointing out that people's acceptance of democracy, because it has a certain limited moral superiority, that moral superiority can't automatically outweigh other moral considerations. And when the moral condemnation of the democratic vote is big enough, then it's understood in the human contract that at this point democracy is not going to be honored. I think that has to be taken into account as a realistic feature of real democratic societies. Yeah.
Is that partially like the understanding, like the Second Amendment, that beyond just like, oh, in theory, if the tyranny came over and like took over the country, like a deliberate violation of democracy, it's like, no, even in the cases where a democracy is still operating, we understand that you have your red lines, and so we're maintaining this kind of...
Look, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I can't come back to the Second Amendment, but I doubt it very much.
Fair.
I think that the Second Amendment was designed to provide for the ability of the people in the country to prevent a tyrannical takeover of the government, not when it's functioning according to the normal rules. But these things I saw when Amy Barrett was being interviewed for the Supreme Court of the United States, and Cory Booker, who was a senator from New Jersey, went to interviewing her. And he was saying, did you read these books about how blacks are suffering at the justice system and the police system and everything else? She didn't comment whether she read them or not. She didn't have to answer that. He said, these books prove that blacks are being systematically disadvantaged and punished because they're black. Mm-hmm. Okay. What are you going to do for them? That's what he asked her. What are you, as a Supreme Court justice, going to do for them? She said, I'm going to read this Constitution, I'm going to interpret the Constitution and apply the law. But what are you going to do for them? Can you hear the mismatch here? You're in a position of power and authority. Do something. Constitution, I know what you're talking about. Do something! Pass a law, give a decision, correct the wrongs. She's saying, what do you mean? There's a structure here, whole governmental structure, and my job is to represent that structure. He didn't know where she was coming from. She knew very well what he was saying. She knew how to answer. But the attitude of respect for the institutions and where you override the institutions is something which divides the different political philosophies. And it's not obvious that one is just vicious and wrong. If you think that the political institutions are themselves vicious, then at a certain point you don't accept their authority, you do something else. I think that there's something really deep going on here. I don't appreciate this very recently. But I'm thinking of we as from Yidden, we vote in the elections, we generally abide by the laws, we generally abide by the democratic decision, except where it crosses our red line. I think everybody has red lines. Everybody has red lines. And I think that's something, if you're going to understand democracy, you have to understand that democracy is a kind of veneer over boiling passions. And the idea is to control the boiling passions and to reduce their destructive power, but it's not a magic bullet, and it's not something which has total moral authority. I think that's very important. Yeah.
What would the Rav say about Rabbanim sort of telling people how to vote?
To say about what?
Rabbanim telling people how to vote in elections. Then?
Rabbanim tell the people how to do what God wants them to do. So it's no different than taking medicine or how you spend your money. Of course. How would you rather do? Use your own intuition? Read the newspapers? Yes.
In a completely halachic Jewish state, what would be the best form of government? And
I have no clue. That question, what would be the government in a completely halachic state, would be the decisions would have thousands of consequences. You have to somebody have comprehensive knowledge of all of the Torah and the knowledge of the consequences. I have no clue. Ideal, I suppose, we go back to what we have in this. If you have the Taryag mitzvahs functionally, which Rambam has the Mishnah Torah, that would tell you what to do.